Hello and welcome back to another psychological video about one of my favorite manga of all time, that being the critically acclaimed Berserk. As a brief disclaimer, if you haven't seen my previous video about Casca's broken ego, you should check that out first, as I will be building on concepts that I laid out there. But with that said, let's get started. Guts began his journey in life in the most unfortunate of circumstances, being born to a lynched mother and left to wallow in a pool of blood and amniotic fluid. Fortunately for the infant Guts, a band of mercenaries found the baby and decided to care for him. After a few years, under Gambino's coarse guidance, Guts quickly developed combat skills to help ward off death. Lamentably though, Guts was neither old enough nor strong enough to defend himself against the vile Donovan, who raped him in his tent. After Gambino suffered a lost leg in battle, the battled mercenary began to resent the flourishing Guts. And after one fateful night, after Gambino divulged that he loathed the young swordsman and that he accepted money from Donovan to violate the boy, Guts, in self-defense, slayed his surrogate father and became a lone wolf mercenary from this point forward. Guts' psychological mindset during the Golden Age arc can be likened to that of a persona-centric individual. As mentioned in my previous Berserk video, the persona is the mask to help circumvent the world and make ourselves more inviting to others. The downside of the persona, however, is that we must divorce ourselves from our animalistic instincts in an effort to present ourselves as sophisticated creatures, lest the herd ostracize us. Nevertheless, as Friedrich Nietzsche noted, there's a profound drawback to admitting the beast within. The human being is, relatively speaking, the most bungled of all the animals, the sickliest, the one most dangerously strayed from its instincts. But for all of that, he is of course the most interesting. Carl Jung makes a similar observation. One could say with a little exaggeration that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. We believe ourselves to be rational beings whom have our emotions in check at all times. But to do so, however, comes at a severe cost. The proliferation of an ever-growing shadow that manifests itself in insidious ways. For Guts, his shadow emerges in the form of rage. To exemplify this point, consider the first moment in which Guts confronted Griffith. He was filled with intense anger and vitriol, despite Griffith's placid demeanor. Luckily for Guts though, his loss to Griffith in their duel was the best thing that could have happened to him, because it allowed Griffith to harness Guts' fury and redirect it towards the Hawk's enemies. And in time, Guts managed to temper the destructive elements of his shadow by lowering the barrier, i.e. the persona, that concealed his true personality. However, the Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Griffith indirectly aided Guts in his psychological journey, but when Griffith transformed into Femto, he took that all away, and then some. Guts was no longer the man that he and his comrades once knew. He was now the living embodiment of his persona, i.e. the Black Swordsman alter ego. Because Griffith was the first man Guts put his trust in, and Griffith subsequently betrayed him, Guts no longer trusted anyone, creating a nearly impenetrable persona barrier that would keep anyone and everyone from ever getting close to him again. This regrettable psychological mindset meant that his shadow, and henceforth rage, would be worse than it ever was. And this is exactly what we saw in the preceding arc, i.e. the Conviction arc. After Guts defeated Mozgus in the Conviction arc, the Black Swordsman came face to face with his mortal enemy, Griffith. And with his indignation at its peak, it looked like the anger-filled swordsman was going to completely lose it. But then, it happened. Guts took notice of the woman whom he gave his heart to, and began to realize that a change was necessary before he utterly destroyed himself. Yet his shadow had proliferated to a point that it begat a beastly alter ego that would haunt him into the current timeline. It is a frightening thought that man also has a shadow side to him, consisting not just of little weaknesses and foibles, but a positively demonic dynamism. Guts' shadow then has a dramatic effect on his consciousness, when it begins to subsume his ego and urges him to rape Casca, just as Griffith did. This event happens in chapter 190 of the manga, which is aptly titled Fangs of Ego. This is what Jung would refer to as shadow possession of the ego consciousness. For you see, no tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down in hell. This is a critical bit of information when you consider the diagram I explained in episode 1 of this video series, because Guts' burgeoning ego and persona begets the unconscious enantiodromia in the form of the shadow, which for Guts rears its head at the most inopportune times and threatens to engulf his consciousness entirely. We then move forward to chapter 226, where Guts tries on the berserker armor. Upon donning the impressive outfit, Guts notices an interesting reaction. More important than that is what's building up inside this body. An impulse, something inside of me, something ferocious is seething. This seething spirit is none other than Guts' shadow, which is given physical form whenever Guts is subsumed by his rage. We could even claim that Guts is a slave to this armor, his shadow, when he doesn't keep his emotions in check. With that said, the berserker armor offers Guts a great convenience in surpassing his previous limitations. Humans have unconsciously established bounds to their strength, so they do not harm their own bodies. Pain is a warning to keep us from destroying ourselves. A human without pain realizes unbelievable strength, reflexes, and perception. This would be equivalent to an athlete entering the zone, i.e. a state of supreme focus and potential. Yet to attain such a state, the athlete must get out of their head, i.e. conscious mind, to permit the unconscious mind to guide the proverbial meat vehicle. It's sort of like allowing the mind to enter into a state of autopilot, where muscle memory and instinctive reactions are the primary driving force. But muscles cannot move without the brain after all, and it just so happens this motor function is found in the unconscious regions. You say I, and you are proud of this word. But greater than this, although you will not believe it, is your body and its great intelligence, which does not say I, but performs I. With that said, there are drawbacks to allowing the shadow to completely submerge the ego into total darkness, that being the loss of the ego consciousness itself. Upon entering Guts, Schierke saw this for herself, that the black swordsman ego was dangerously close to collapsing into nothingness. What saved him, however, was the talisman from Schierke's former teacher. Now, if you want to learn more about Schierke and the role of witches and wizards in Berserk, that will come in a future video. But trust me, these symbols are profoundly relevant to the story. Schierke eventually saves Guts from his state of shadow possession, but this wouldn't be the last time Guts needed her aid from descending down the dark path. After reaching the sea, Schierke recalls the past day's events and remarks, no matter how robust Guts is, if a mere human is to exchange blows with those monsters, for that, he must, as a human, become a monster. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process, he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into the abyss will gaze back into you. The Skull Knight also warns Guts that the Berserker armor will rob him of taste, vision, warmth, and everything else that makes him human, i.e. his conscious mind. A few chapters later, while fighting crocodile monsters in his Berserker armor, Guts hears the waves of the sea and remarks, "The roar of the sea. It swells blackly from the expanse of the dark night. It draws me down to the seabed." Water is the commonest symbol for the unconscious. Why would Jung state this, you may ask? Because from a visual perspective, we can see the surface contents of a large body of water, but the depth and sheer magnitude of it is beyond our initial perception. The same goes for the unconscious mind. In fact, according to modern-day neuroscience, the unconscious mind is the workhorse of the brain, leading neuroscientist David Eagleman to claim, the conscious you, which is the part that flickers to life when you wake up in the morning, is the smallest bit of what's happening in your head. It's like a broom closet in the mansion of the brain. From the analogy to water to modern-day neuroscience, we can see that Guts' inner struggle is the task of a lifetime. But the worst enemy you can meet will always be yourself. You lie in wait for yourself in the caverns and forest. Hence, Guts continues to struggle with the unconscious beast within, and even resembles a savage animal when he chomps down on a dead monster's remains. For any Evangelion fans, Guts' barbarity is parallel to the moment in which Eva Unit 1 went berserk and began eating Zarel, the angel. That's because in both moments, Shinji and Guts allowed their shadow to consume them, becoming nothing more than an unconscious beast. After Schierke aided Guts in controlling his anger, the Black Swordsman comes up against a sea god that represents a giant whale. And it is the battle within the whale that crystallizes Guts' psychological state post-eclipse, the underlying issue that Guts has not addressed and may come as a surprise to many of the readers. This issue being Guts' depression. That's right. Guts is and has always been depressed ever since he saw Femto rape Casca, and this is verified by examining his symptoms since that fateful day. Now, depression affects many people in many different ways, but for men, the symptoms present themselves in ways that may not be interpreted as such. Such symptoms for men include hiding emotions via anger, irritability, and aggressiveness. Lethargy, as noted by Guts' extreme fatigue after fending off his shadow, feelings of anxiousness or being on edge, withdrawing from friends and family, and engaging in high-risk activities. This culminates inside of the whale god, when Guts can't see, hear, and is shrouded in darkness, and loses all sense of time. This is analogous to the biblical story of Jonah and the whale, where similar events occur to Jonah. The idea here is that when one is in the belly of the whale, they lose all sense of self, and become disconnected from society and themselves. Upon leaving the whale, they find themselves in a strange land, where they must learn to rediscover themselves through a process of self-evaluation, or fall victim to another trip in the belly of the whale. What do you plan to do in the land of the sleepers? You have been floating in a sea of solitude, and the sea has borne you up. At long last, are you ready for dry land? Are you ready to drag yourself ashore? And where does Guts next touch land? In Elfhelm, fairy hometown, or as I like to call it, the land of psychologist. For you see, Guts, for 361 chapters, has been saving all of the people around him. Everyone except for himself. But to save himself, with the help of the people of Elfhelm, he must find a manner in which he can integrate his shadow into his conscious self, so as to complement him rather than consume him. This integration of the shadow cannot take place and be put to a useful purpose unless one can admit the tendencies bound up with the shadow and allow them some measure of realization, tempered, of course, with the necessary criticism. This leads to disobedience and self-disgust, but also to self-reliance, without which individuation is unthinkable. Thank you for watching the second part in this Berserk psychoanalysis video series. In the next episode, we'll take a look at Griffith and evaluate his current psychological state. Thanks again.